So my name is Joanne Fahy, and I'm the Director of Research Communications here at the University of Notre Dame. I hope for those of you who were there last night, you had an enriching experience at the opening keynote and our reception. And I hope you're excited to delve deeper into this important topic today. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of our event, titled Civic Science and Ethics in the Age of AI, Building Trust. As we continue our discussions and explorations, we remain focused on the crucial intersections of science, technology, ethics, and public trust. Yesterday, Amy Ames shared insights on how trustworthiness will become an even more important currency for scientists and science communicators as the AI future unfolds. Today, we build on that foundation, further exploring the theme of civic science, which is especially pertinent in the context of AI. Civic science emphasizes the involvement of diverse stakeholders in the scientific process, promoting transparency, inclusivity, and public engagement. In the age of AI, this means not only creating technologies that serve the public good, but also ensuring that these technologies are understood, trusted, and accepted by the public. Trust, as we know, is not given lightly. It must be earned through consistent, transparent, and ethical practices. Before we proceed, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of our co-organizers, speakers, and participants who've contributed to making this symposium a success. Your dedication and commitment to these important discussions are truly inspiring. Now, it's my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Dietram Scheufele. Dr. Scheufele is the Taylor-Bascom Chair in Science Communications at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's one of the leading scholars in the field of science communication. His research focuses on understanding how communication shapes public attitudes toward emerging technologies, including AI, nanotechnology, and synthetic biology. Dr. Scheufele has authored numerous influential publications and has been a key figure in advancing our understanding of how to effectively engage with the public in discussions about science and technology. His work emphasizes the importance of creating dialogues that are not only informative, but also inclusive and reflective of diverse perspectives. Today, Dr. Scheufele will share his insights on the role of science communication in building trust in the age of AI. His expertise and experience will provide us with valuable guidance on how we can better engage with the public to build trust in our rapidly changing technological world. Once again, welcome to the second day of the symposium. Let us continue to learn from each other, challenge our assumptions, and work together towards a future where AI is developed and deployed with the highest ethical standards and with the trust of the public. Thank you for being here. I look forward to insightful discussions and exchanges that will take place today. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dietram Scheufele to Notre Dame. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think I'm all hooked up here yet. Thank you so much, Joanne, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. This is my first time on campus, and I'm looking forward to hopefully walking around a little bit when the rain lets up later this afternoon. Sometimes I realize it's really hard when you can't see your own slides and you're presenting. This is obviously not a problem in this room. I can see them everywhere. I do want to spend a little bit of time, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion as well, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking through three things. Number one, what I would call a new age of maybe civic science, and I know we'll do a deeper dive into what that is and what that means. I want to talk about 5 challenges that I think we're currently facing. There are probably many more, but I think there are 5 that are unique to our time, and both politically and scientifically, and then end up with maybe a few pathways forward or just a few thoughts on what I think are fruitful ways of moving forward. I'll keep it pretty high level because I think we'll do deeper dives into almost everything that I'm saying today. So I'll start with the idea of a new age of civic science. This is footage of traffic during Thanksgiving in Los Angeles. And the reason I'm putting this up there is because it's probably one of the first examples of what then the literature later on called in urban planning a wicked problem. meaning it's a problem that doesn't have a clear-cut solution. Right? We could all stop driving. That's not going to happen. We could all switch to bicycles. We could have public transportation in an earthquake-prone area. None of these things are ideal, and they all require compromise solutions with different societal values and scientific information feeding a policy solution. And every urban environment deals with the exact same sets of wicked issues, but of course, fast forward to AI and you have your classic wicked issue. Unimaginable benefits to AI, medicine, everything, military, our daily lives, Internet of Things, and so on and so forth, biology, academic disciplines. But also tons of ethical, moral, political challenges that we need to work through, and none of which have clear-cut best solutions. They only have relatively best solutions that require value trade-offs between individual liberties, societal benefits, academic progress, innovation, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk through tons of examples, and I know you've already touched on some of these, of why AI is pushing the boundaries of civic science. So even when we anticipate, I mean, we've known this idea of wicked science came up in the 1980s. Since then, it's been gone through multiple iterations. But even if we anticipate wickedness, and I think CRISPR was a really good example, this new genome editing technology that allows us to make modifications either somatically or germline, so in ways that are heritable by our biological children. Really exciting prospects for curing genetically inherited diseases, but also, of course, ethical, moral, political questions. One of the things that we got right about CRISPR is that we invested early on. Joanne just spoke to civic science having a focus on communities, that we focused on communities that typically are not the first target of new medical developments. For instance, patients with sickle cell disease, so people with African, or largely people with African descent or from African descent. So great. We, for the first time, rolled out applications that serve traditionally underserved communities, except for the treatment is $2 to $3 million each, which makes it largely unaffordable for many of the people who really do need it. AI is the same way. We knew it would be wicked. We knew we would have to talk through ethics and politics from the very beginning. The tricky part, if you've read that piece in the Post, is that the people who do talk about the ethics of AI, a vast majority of them are on the payroll of big tech. So we kind of got it right, but we also kind of messed it up at the same time. This is where a whole host of challenges come in. And some of you will remember the folks up here in the middle, Ralph Cicerone, former president, unfortunately passed away since then, Ralph Cicerone, who said, look, given all these challenges that are coming our way, scientists need to really figure out a good way of talking to the public directly, especially as our legacy infrastructures for journalism start to collapse. And then Alan Leshner, who at the time was still CEO of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, pushed it a step further, saying it's not just scientists talking to the public, and I'll come back to that idea later, that translational or transactional communication, but we need to have an honest, bidirectional dialogue between not just about the promise of science, but also about its perils and pitfalls, I think he called it at the time. When we push that idea all the way, that idea of bidirectional dialogue, it involves a lot of listening and a lot of paying attention for us as scientists to things that we may disagree with, values, whatever else. This is a scale that we published at some point in PNAS a couple of years ago of saying this is when we talk about public engagement to this bidirectional dialogue. It ranges from, on the very left, maybe cynical or more translational, transactional approaches. So can we inform the public? Can we avoid public controversy like we saw for genetically modified organisms or some other technologies for CRISPR and AI? To on the very right, the idea of actually shaping policy and what John Evans at UC San Diego calls the public's right to say no. The reason I put a hard of hearing patient here is because that was when we issued the report for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on the future of CRISPR, one of the communities who was very outspoken, who told us, what you're offering to us in the hard of hearing community, meaning treatments, genetic or CRISPR treatments to cure what you cure a genetically inherited disease, we don't consider it a disease. This is our identity. We don't want to be cured by you. And again, that's a very hard thing to listen to for a room full of medical professionals who are really excited about this new technology and can't fathom the idea that a patient doesn't want their treatment. But that's the honest bidirectional dialogue that we're really talking about. That dialogue has a bunch of challenges that I do want to talk through, at least, as I said, very high level, and I will not do them justice. So if they sound provocative without enough evidence, please do push back in the Q&A. That's the idea. I'm going to start with one that a lot of people will disagree with, but I will say it anyway, and that is the idea that just follow the science has been an unbelievably unproductive way of communicating scientific consensus. We saw this during COVID when the scientific community rightfully was frustrated with some of the public pushback against what looked pretty clear-cut science, and basically said, just follow the science. It's not that difficult. The evidence is clear. We know what we need to do. Tons of complexity surrounding that we can talk about, mask-wearing policy recommendations. But most importantly, even if you follow the science for wicked issues, and COVID was one, you may end up with very different conclusions. In the US, AstraZeneca is a great example. So vaccine that there was some concerns raised about blood clots in female patients of certain age groups. Ultimately, we decided it was safe. We had stockpiled it like other vaccines, but didn't use it. Eventually, we said, it is safe, but we're going to give it to Mexico and Canada. That was one way of dealing with the issue. Germany, this is the former chancellor, Angela Merkel, vaccinated large proportions of their population with AstraZeneca. She actually went on television to be vaccinated with AstraZeneca to show that it was safe. Within a month, Denmark, a couple countries north of Germany, said, absolutely not, it's not safe, we're not using it at all. So, safe, but we're going to give it to Canada and Mexico. Absolutely safe, not safe at all. All these countries followed the science. They engaged in a good faith effort to follow the science as well as possible and to come up with good policy solutions, and they all came to diametrically opposed conclusions about what the right policy was. So the idea that there is a necessary policy outcome to science is just not naive, it's actually incorrect, and it's misleading. And some of the narrative that we've used in the US about certain members of political parties or of political ideologies not following the science, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I know that there's more nuance to that statement, but I'll let it sit to that extreme anyway. Second challenge is that, of course, we all in this room have our own blinders, our own biases, our own priors. We like to think that we're all neutral and we look at evidence absolutely neutrally. We do not. We engage in the exact same motivated reasoning and biased reasoning as everybody else. What's interesting is this is a graph that Matt Nisbet at Northeastern put together where he basically showed down, I can't really, I'll just point with my finger here, where he showed in the bottom left-hand, so this is liberal, conservative, and Republican, Democrat down here, New York Times readers, Daily Show viewers, CNN viewers, and AAAS members, so basically the scientific community, members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And they're sitting ideologically as far left at the bottom as Tea Party members, Mormon church members, evangelicals, and so on are sitting up here. The interesting thing is the general public, on average, is sitting right here. So one way or the other, when we're communicating, we're not just pretty far away from many of the groups that we really do want to communicate with about issues that have moral or ethical challenges, but we're also, both groups are sitting pretty far away from the general population. So as we're thinking through these wicked problems and the value trade-offs that they require, an acute awareness of how different our value systems are as scientists, and I'm very much part of that bottom left-hand corner, is a crucially important one. Why is it so important? Because of a third challenge, and that is when we talk about civic science, and Fanuel and others will talk about this more, but we often, when we say communities, we mean a very specific type of community, underserved, a community that has not received the attention from the scientific community, and I'll come back to some of those in a second. And that's hugely important. But a lot of our wicked issues have something to do with reaching audiences that may have self-selected out of the discourses that we as scientists are putting forth. I put Trump voters here. What about industry and commercial interests? Are we able and willing to talk about some of the really difficult issues, hard to grapple with issues, emerging scientific consensus on gender-affirming surgery and others, that some groups oppose on moral and value-based grounds, regardless of what the science says? And again, all of us in this room probably even have different takes on this, so I don't mean to endorse any position necessarily. But again, it's a reasonable societal discourse to have between the trade-offs of values and religion and ideology and the scientific consensus that we're putting forth. That's my earlier point about wicked problems. They do not have a clear-cut solution that's free, that's value-free. And we've all seen, I'm sure, this campus, Notre Dame, is not any different from any other campus. Some of the really different interpretations of the conflicts and recent conflicts in the Middle East are probably a really good illustration. Are we ready and able to speak to those communities when we talk about civic science? That brings us to a fourth challenge, and that fourth challenge is well, actually, let me before I go to that fourth challenge, set that up with survey data that came out of Georgetown that I think highlights, and if we're honest, all of our schizophrenia when it comes to compromise and talking across lines of difference. So when you ask people, should compromise and common ground, should that be a goal for political leaders? Everybody agrees, right? We all say, yes, absolutely compromise. We need to, the dysfunction we're seeing in DC right now is just not doable. But when you ask the second question, and that is, do you agree or disagree that with the statement, I'm tired of my leaders compromising positions and helping the other side? We also agree. So we want compromise, but we only want compromise if our side wins. And again, as I was saying, like, we probably all kind of feel that a little bit, right? So we don't want dysfunction, but we feel strongly that our values are on abortion or whatever else is coming our way is really important. And ultimately, though, we also all agree that respect for each other is a really important part of that honest bidirectional dialogue that Alan Leshner called for. And that brings me now as the setup to my fourth one, and that is we as scientists are really bad at respectful dialogue. We're really horrible at it. And it's partly because we know better, right? We're trained and we've done this for decades. But sometimes we're also just being gratuitous about it. And I know this is another one that many people will disagree with, but I think some of our most visible spokespeople haven't done the best job at building the kind of trust that Joanne talked about, that I know yesterday's keynote that unfortunately I had to miss talked about. The idea that we're respectful of viewpoints, to that last slide, the Georgetown poll, that differ from our own. Bill Nye, when this was a review in Gizmodo that I really liked, watch his show and you'll get yelled at for an hour for being wrong. But I want to show you some others. This is Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeting on this day long ago. This was on December 25th when he tweeted that a child was born who by the age of 30 would transform the world. Happy birthday, Isaac Newton. Maybe it's a little bit funny, right? But trolling Christians on their holiest of holidays is gratuitous. And then saying, hey, by the way, I'm making fun of your values and your belief system. Now listen to me on climate change, on GMOs, and on everything else is a really hard sell. And ultimately, and when I say gratuitous, I really mean that. It's unnecessary. It's very much unnecessary to signal that our values misalign and then expect to have effective communication. Michael Mann, who at the time was at Penn State, he's now at Penn, tweeting that everybody with an R next to their name, every Republican, is not safe to have in Congress, and then turning around saying, please, Republicans, listen to me on climate change. Again, not the way to really have effective communication. And Richard Dawkins, I think, I mean, everybody has read his stuff and heard him talk about and ridiculing people who have concerns about work on with embryos. Again, not the most productive pathway to communication. The tricky part in the US, we're beginning to see, and I know we talk about trust a lot, and I'm somebody who's much more optimistic about trust in science than many other people. It's been fairly stable over time. It continues to be fairly stable. I'll come back to this in a second. But it is beginning to show cracks. And this is data from University of Chicago, NRC, and you'll see the blue lines are liberals, the red lines are conservatives, and then the gray line are the 40% independents in this country. And yes, there have always been differences. Yes, there have always been ups and downs. We've always been second in terms of trusted institutions just to the military. But now we're seeing two things. And number one is this. This was at the height of COVID. What happened there? Wide gaps opened up, but they opened up between two groups. The blue group are Democrats. 30% of the public really excited about science. Why? Because it became a political signaling tool. We're following the science. Anybody who's with Trump doesn't. So trusting the science became actually an expression of partisan identity. For the first time in history, 2/3 of Democrats said, we trust science. Do they trust us on gene drives, on nuclear energy, on GMOs? Absolutely not. They trust us as a signaling tool that they're not Trump, and they dislike how Trump dealt with the pandemic. But the second really important part from this gap is that if you add up the red and the gray lines, they're 70%, 70% of the US population. So during COVID, we left behind 70% of the US population in terms of trust because they both either stayed the same or dipped a little bit. And then since then, if you look at this graph, now we're seeing all the groups kind of starting to dip. What do I mean by that? The conclusion there is we've seen decline of trust in all institutions, journalism, Congress, whatever else, over the last decades. Science and the military have been immune because they have a unique claim to the service that they provide and or to the kind of information that they provide. The moment our information becomes or gets seen by some as partisan or as being motivated by partisan or by ideological or value-based considerations, we will have a problem because we'll become just one of many other institutions rather than the one institution that can make a reasonable claim to being systematic, objective, and neutral in how we produce and curate and share information. So I think we're at a really important kind of junction in time moving forward. The last challenge, and this is one that I don't have any good answers for, but we're at a point, and Dominique Broussard, my department chair, and I wrote about this in Science a couple of years back. We are shifting toward an information environment away from legacy media, from broadcasting, where we take information and we send it out to 340 million Americans, to an environment where we narrowcast, where all of our preferences, the terabytes and petabytes of data that every single one of us has produced over the course of our life, location data, digital trace data, behavioral data of what we clicked on, whose photos we looked at, for how long, which ones we downloaded, and so on, what our credit card transactions were. All of these data produce a treasure trove of basically food for algorithms that allows narrow casting and micro-targeting. So narrowcasting being a counter to broadcasting of information. That means that we can now create not just deep fakes, but live footage that looks like Donald Trump or any politician speaks, but it's really the research assistant at Stanford that's speaking in real time, so synthetic realities that are indistinguishable from truth. It also means that we can, and Amazon has done this for at least 10 years, predictively model behavior, meaning if I'm up in Madison, I have prime shipping, they need to know what I'm likely to buy, because by the time it has to go to the shipping center in Illinois from California or from wherever else it's coming, and I want it with one-day shipping, they need to already have it shipped to the shipping center so they can send it up when I press that purchase button. How do I know that? By basically knowing my social network, by knowing the patterns of how products get picked up in my social networks, my search history, my credit card history, and so on, and then I can predict pretty clearly what I'm going to do in the next, better than I can, in the next 2 or 3 days, and what I'm going to order from Amazon. As I said, the narrowcasting is one that has happened even for traditional media. Even the Washington Post and others have long A/B tested their articles. So before they go online, they go actually online in 5 different versions with different headlines, and within 15 minutes they know what the engagement on social is, how much it's shared, how deep it's gotten into X or whatever else. And then that's the headline or the lead that ends up running. And the other 4 just go away. If you ever Google a news story that somebody sends to you and it pops up with a different title or a different lead, that's what's happening there with the A/B testing. And then, of course, our TikTok feeds, our Google searches or Gemini searches, whatever they are now, our X timelines and so on, even if we follow the exact same sources, look fundamentally different because they're curated algorithmically. And ultimately, the idea of I know Gen AI is the topic here as well, the idea of generative AI and news being generated, not by journalists, but and in the stock market, we've done this for a while now, where announcements about stocks outperforming quarterly expectations have long been written by algorithms. Now we're going, of course, with the recent advent of some of the new Gen AI tools, we're going into a whole new world here. Why is that so important? Because for science, of course, this creates fundamental challenges in how we reach people who don't care about science or may have misperceptions about science, and we'll get more and more and more of that because of algorithmic curation, and get less and less and less of if you will, the proverbial spinach, right? We get more and more French fries because that's what we keep paying attention to, and we get less and less spinach. A bad metaphor, but gets the point across. The cynicism among the tech industry is pretty pronounced. Adam Kramer said at some point after a pretty controversial study in PNAS came out that Facebook is the largest field study in the history of the world. Absolutely true. It's also the largest field study that absolutely nobody has access to other than Meta, meaning we don't have the data, we don't get access to the data. And so that doesn't allow us, and this is my version of a black box, it doesn't allow us to answer some of the core questions of what we need to know for effective civic science. How can we communicate, for example, scientific consensus on platforms that are made for outrage, right? If people get upset about my tweets, they get traction. They end up high on timelines. If there's lots of engagement and disagreement, it's an outrage-fueled algorithm. How do we communicate the boring version of that, meaning science is settled, we know it's right, in platforms that are optimized for the exact opposite? How do we have those difficult value-based debates? How do we have those debates that are informed by the best available evidence, but we disagree on what the policy outcomes should be for vaccines, for medical treatments, for gender-affirming surgery, and so on and so forth? And ultimately, how do we as a society come together and form consensus and pathways forward? Because that's where we're stuck as a society at the moment. So when we talk about civic science, figuring out pathways forward where we can come together and saying that's the best way for us as a country to move, even though Denmark or Germany, to my earlier example, may do something different. And again, we haven't figured out how to do that in an information environment that already is largely dominated by these algorithmically curated information streams. But if you look at demographic data, the next generation, that's the only information that they take in. There's no more New York Times website that they're going to. There's no more email that they get in the morning with a summary of The Economist. There's only algorithmically curated delivery. So one way or the other, we'll have to deal with it. So let me close with a few thoughts on how to move forward. They're still not super optimistic, heads up, but they're hopefully getting a little bit better than the depressing middle part of this narrative. The good news is that we have tons of work coming out. I've been fortunate enough to be involved with Alan Leshner, who I mentioned earlier, Ralph Cicero, and others, more than 12 years ago at the academies, national academies, to get underway an effort to establish a science of science communication. So can we harness social science research in psychology and political science and communication science and sociology and other fields to inform our efforts with scientific evidence, to be ironically, scientific about how we communicate science. There are a number of special issues that are all open access that summarize some of that early work that eventually then led to let me go back here, to a consensus study that Rita Allen Foundation and others funded at the academies on communicating science effectively. And I think this room is a really good representation of the philosophy of that report, saying it's not about the social science, it's about the social science in service of the on-the-ground work that we all do to communicate science. So how can we do better social science to serve people who are doing this for a living, who try to do civic science, and what are the questions that they don't have good answers to, and how can the scientific community themselves help get to those answers? Since then, Kathleen Hall-Jameson and I at Penn and Dan Kahan at Yale and I did a handbook on the science of science communication that unfortunately is not openly accessible, but if anybody wants access to the PDF, is this going to be published and posted? Email me, whatever. And so Kathleen won't be happy that I just offered to send the PDF out for free. But since then, we focused more and more on misinformation as one, and then at the end, or during COVID in particular, the now Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication that I co-chair at the National Academies is now focusing more and more on how do we rethink all of this after the failures of COVID. And by failures, I mean the science communication failures, not some of the other issues that we can discuss. I'll just skip this one really quickly. But so if that's the good news, the bad news is we're not really following our own advice. And this is where some of you will disagree with me. And again, I really look forward to pushback here. There is absolutely no silver bullet. And I realize this is not a silver bullet. This is metal jacket, but whatever. There's no silver bullet for science communication. There's no one thing that unfortunately hasn't stopped us from trying. So the problem is solutions differ across controversies, right? A controversy like CRISPR or a discussion around CRISPR is fundamentally different from a discussion around climate change or a discussion around genetically modified organisms or nanotechnology or AI. Depending on what audiences and stakeholders we're talking about. For nanotechnology, it was largely a policy debate that was inside the Beltway. For CRISPR, a little bit broader. AI, obviously, immensely broad in terms of audiences and stakeholders. And then what do we actually want to achieve? Do we want to inform the public? Do we want to get that honest bidirectional dialogue? Do we want to have public engagement and so on and so forth? Unfortunately, the fact that there is no silver bullet hasn't stopped us from reinventing that idea again and again, and I just want to walk through some of them. We started at some point, and many of you have heard this, with the idea of knowledge deficits, this deficit model thinking. The idea was the public doesn't know enough. True, no argument here. But the second part of that is where the problem comes in. If we could only inform the public, then they would make better choices. And there's no piece of social science that supports the idea that closing those knowledge deficits will actually make the public more informed. Then we were like, okay, fine, knowledge deficits don't work. Let's switch to trust deficits. They don't trust us, and if they just trusted us, then the world would be better off. As I said already, story is much more complicated. I'll get to that in a second. Then we were like, well, if it's not trust, if they keep trusting us as much as the military, and the last data set showed medical doctors and others during COVID being among the most highly trusted sources, is that it's a narrative deficit. If we told better stories, then they would follow us. And again, yes, some of it is true, depending on audiences and issues. And then the last one, of course, was full circle back to knowledge deficits. It's not that people don't know enough, it's that they know the wrong things, and if they only knew the right things, then they would make different decisions. Again, very much at odds with the idea of a wicked problem. I may know everything about the science, but my values may still very much be at odds with some of the policy solutions or the scientific progress put forth. Addressing that, we at some point wrote a piece in the American Scientist where we said we need to stop, and this is the key takeaway here, thinking about the American public or parts of the public or communities as having these pathologies that science needs to fix. You don't know enough. You're misinformed. You don't trust us enough. And if we can fix those pathologies, then we as science can continue the way we do. Civic science implies that science itself has a new orientation and a new way of looking at this. Trust, I think, is being a great example, and I just want to show you two things here. One is, and this is not me being just weirdly asymmetrical and having bad vision, that may be true too, but what I'm trying to show you in that graph here is on the left, so this is on the y-axis, how healthy are our science-society interfaces? How healthy is the intersection of science and society? And I will argue that if we have 0% public trust, we're obviously in negative territory. It's bad, right? It's not good for our scientific enterprise and for its scientific impacts. But I will also argue that if we have 100% trust, if everybody in the US fully trusts science, we also have a problem. We're pushing boundaries of what it means to be human with CRISPR, with combinations of AI and biology. We're doing things in artificial intelligence that are probably pushing boundaries of what some people consider reasonable guardrails for privacy, for other things. So no, we do want a critical public that engages continuously with science. So somewhere in the middle, or not in the middle, I intentionally made this curve kind of skewed over to the right. Somewhere here is where we want society to be. We want them to be largely trusting of science, but we also want a critical public in different communities engaging critically. Where that range is, we don't know, and we haven't really spent a lot of time. We're largely saying we need to rebuild trust, and then things are going to be better. Yes, absolutely, no argument here. But the range of where we want that final kind of ideal outcome to be, I think, is up for grabs. Second, we often talk about building trust as kind of the, as the key dependent variable. But I'm going to argue that really what our key dependent variable is something that will ultimately lead to trust. And trust is not our problem. Our problem are continued disparities. Henrietta Lacks, everybody knows the story at Hopkins, the Tuskegee experiments in treatment, or rather non-treatment of patients. And we're saying, well, this is why trust is missing, or is maybe lagging or lacking among certain communities. Absolutely true. But if I'm an African-American woman in 2024 in the US, I have a 3 times higher chance of dying from complications related to childbirth before or after birth than a white mother. If I'm rich, I have still a 200% higher chance, twice as high. So my lack of trust is actually the right response. My lack of trust is not an unreasonable response, and let's just fix the trust problem. We have a disparity problem, and once we fix the disparity problem, trust will follow. So the dependent variable here is really a different one, and what we see as a lack of trust based on historical inequities is actually a reasonable reaction to continuing inequities that simply need to be fixed. So what do I mean? And I'm really getting to the end here. Hopefully, I'm not fully over yet. Okay, I'm not getting the you need to stop now signal yet. I just want to show you a little bit of kind of how we, and I also co-chair, or I chair rather, the advisory committee for the Civic Science program at the Rita Allen Foundation, and how we kind of think about the larger model. So I talked about deficit models and kind of addressing these knowledge deficits or others. And I want to walk that back a little bit, because there's absolutely room for that in, for example, doctor-patient communication. Right? I go to the doctor because I want to know what's wrong, and I want to know what I can do to make it better. So the idea that scientists are actually the key actors, they communicate settled science to an audience who comes to them to hear what the current consensus or findings are, and ultimately the idea is I'm going to change behaviors, I'm going to get treatment, I'm going to take medicines, whatever else. So in some contexts, deficit model thinking is actually a really important part of science communication, and I don't want us to just throw that out in spite of my simplistic overview earlier. But that has been replaced, I mentioned Alan Leshner, by these broader engagement and maybe even co-creation models. So this idea that we need that bidirectional dialogue, that we can all reasonably disagree on values and other things, and that the actors are not just scientists, but they're scientists and other stakeholders from communities. The communication then is not just science to audiences, but the it's more bidirectional, more horizontal. We exchange ideas. We even co-create potentially scientific progress, public health, other places, community-based participatory research, and so on. So we're much more horizontal. A lot of it still happens, and I would, again, maybe that's phrased simplistically, but a lot of it still happens in and on the terms of science. So in other words, scientists tend to be the ones who create these research projects, who involve communities, who have opportunities for public engagement. I'm sure this campus is like everyone else. And you have these public engagement events, Science on Tap and other things, science festivals, where we create an environment where the public can come in and kind of interact with us. So ultimately, civic science pushes that idea one step further. And it says when fairly or not fairly, when fundamentally disruptive technologies like AI arrive, science becomes just one of many, many stakeholders. We're one stakeholder, but there are tons of other stakeholders, and in AI, we're not even the most important scientific stakeholder because we don't have the capacity that a Google or a Microsoft or whoever else has. Very few universities will even get close to building capacity that allows them to build large language models that can compete with the kinds of development work that's being done at DeepMind or elsewhere. So we may not even be the most important player in producing the science of AI, but we're certainly at the same level as community groups, as politicians, as regulators, as global organizations, and so on and so forth. So we have a fundamentally broader set of actors, number one. The process is one where we really need to sort through wicked problems that science can inform but cannot answer. And that's the key part. Science cannot tell us how to best move forward with AI. They can tell us what the likely outcomes are of moving forward in different ways, but they can't tell us how to balance the different value judgments, all the things that we talked about, and to answer questions that ultimately do not have a scientific answer. Should we push forward with certain things, and so on and so forth. And I think all the applications that we're seeing for AI already, from, again, medicine and other things to privacy, to military applications, to tons of other application areas, tell us why that rethinking within science in terms of how we roll out technologies in these new environments is crucially important. I'll end with one last one, and that is a challenge for us to take ultimately the idea of public engagement and listening and maybe changing the way we do science seriously. This is a piece that Liz Neely, when she was still at the Story Collider, she's since then started her own consulting firm, and I did a white paper for DeepMind. So this is the AI research arm of Google, of Alphabet. This is probably like 7, 8 years ago now. And in that white paper, we argued that, look, your approach to this will have to be informed. We didn't call it civic science at the time, but by this constant dialogue with the public. And we gave this presentation to them in London, and they listened politely, and then they paid us, and we went away. And I think that's kind of how far that got. More recently, we again pushed for that idea as Chuck Schumer ended up with meeting $500 million worth of net worth of leaders in AI to come up with regulation. So again, let's work with industry, let's work with leaders, but not really engage in civic science. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is one of my favorite books written by a Swiss playwright, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, during the height of the nuclear scare in the 60s, where it's a play where scientists realize that they've done something that gives too much power to politicians and military leaders, and they take refuge in an insane asylum to protect their finding from society because they realize this is going to be deeply disruptive. And eventually, fast forward, spoiler alert, the only insane person is the person who runs the insane asylum, who basically incarcerates them forever and takes all their findings away and rules the world. And at the end of the play, they all turn to the audience and say this one line, and that is, what concerns all of humanity can only be solved by all of humanity. And I think that's where, for me, the essence is of civic science, right? It's not a scientific problem. It's not a political problem. It's not a regulatory problem. It's not an ethical or moral question. It's all of the above. And we have absolutely no infrastructure or very little to navigate that well just yet. And so that's, I think, where the challenge is in front of us. And with that, I'll thank you very much, and I look forward to hopefully pushback and lots of Q&A. Thank you so much for having me. I think there's a mic coming.
So, did you hear me? Okay. So, I think all of us in this room are kind of like, yeah, we're with you, right? So, what efforts are currently very promising with regard to moving this idea of the importance of civic science from the sociology realm to our engineers and computer science people and people that we want to work with in the research?
Yeah. I think there's both a push and pull. Really good question, first of all. There's both a push and pull. I happen to be, and I spent all of my career in social science departments that are in colleges of agriculture and life sciences. I was at Cornell before, and then moved to Wisconsin. And the idea of the reason those social science departments exist goes back to the mid-19th century when we created land grants. And if you look at the congressional language actually says we need to teach farmers to grow 2 blades of grass instead of 1. We don't just do the science, we also have to make the science useful for our populations. So the idea of translation was built in by Morrill, by Lincoln, by others at the height of the Civil War as we're thinking through the Morrill Act and other things, right? So there's tons of foresight actually built into structures at land-grant universities that we've lost a little bit. So that's not the answer to your question, because I'm kind of telling you, we kind of lost this along the way. But here's my pull and push answer. What I'm really excited about is that there's a pull from graduate students more and more who are demanding that kind of work from STEM grad students, that work becomes part of their portfolio. We have students at Wisconsin, we offer both a grad minor and a Ph.D. minor and a grad certificate in science communication for people in STEM fields. And that has been in our department, one of the fastest growing programs. We have people who come to Wisconsin in microbiology, and as they accept their offer, they tweet, I'm really excited to come to microbio at UW, partly because I can do a Ph.D. minor in science communication, because I can think about the larger issues. So I think there is a maturity, a way of looking at the problems that I'm outlining among younger generation STEM students that I never had at their age. So I think that's very heartening. So that's what I mean by kind of the pull, right? So these people are really saying, look, we want this. The second thing that I think is a really interesting effort, Keith Yamamoto, who is outgoing president or former president of AAAS at UCSF, and Alan Leshner, who I mentioned earlier, are chairing an effort with Research America. Well, actually, Fenwell can talk about this. I don't know where he is, but there we go. He can talk about this 1,000 times better because he's actually centrally leading that effort. So you can just jump in when I butcher it. Thinking through how can we get some competency, some training in this kind of work established in every STEM program in the country. And again, I will not kill the punchline because I don't know. I'm just a small foot soldier in that process, so he can talk about this a lot more. But I think there's exciting kind of efforts. And then the Civic Science Fellows Program is the last one that I'll mention, where private philanthropy, Rita Allen Foundation, Gordon Betty Moore, Kavli, Chan Zuckerberg are getting together and are saying, can we fund leaders of tomorrow in journalism, in STEM fields, in other fields of academia, in informal science education centers, who will go through a fellowship program together and eventually take leadership positions in different institutions. So somebody who will run the Exploratorium 30 years from now will call their former fellow at, I don't know, Harvard, at WGBH in Boston, and saying, look, we really need to change the discourse. And so that's another, I think, the push from philanthropy, from private philanthropy in particular, I think will make a huge difference there. So, yeah, I'll let you decide where you take the microphone, or should I? Okay, and then we'll go. I would come off stage, but I was told I cannot come off stage. So it's not that I want to be up here.
Okay, so I've taken exactly one sociology class, and I remember that it's near impossible to change people's values. And so I was wondering how and if you can communicate science to someone whose values go against it. And now that it's so, like, science is so politicized, is science a value itself?
Yeah, so thank you for like 3 really easy questions. So I will actually argue that it would be fundamentally normatively wrong to try and change people's values, for science to try and change people's values. And I think all of us in this room would not respond well, right, to our values, to there being interventions against our values. But I think just philosophically that would be wrong in the first place, so I would argue we should never do that in the first place. Now, I have pretty strongly held values that are part of my biography and other things, but so communication for science or of science depends again on what the outcome is. But can I get facts across that people may reject based on their priors and their values? I took some slides out just to give you a sense of to shorten this a little bit, but to give you one sense, and maybe I can put those up really quickly. I think they're still hidden in there. Let me just see if this comes back. Because they're pretty striking. And that is our own values as academics doing the exact same thing. So I'll just put that up here. Well, maybe you don't need to see my Dropbox, but whatever. Well, let me just make sure that hopefully this works. This is up, yeah. So this is a study in PNAS that we all know what that is. It's basically gender bias in academia, right? It shows that all of us male and female academics, we pay female candidates less on average. We write letters of recommendation that use the word brilliant less often, and so on and so forth. So very clearly established phenomenon. It's not good, but we know it's true, unfortunately. Here's where the values and communicating facts against values comes in. And that is when you tell academics, males and females, that the research shows that they're biased, what males do is they look at that research and say, oh, it's not good research. It's bad research. So they rate the quality of research lower. Why? Because I don't like the finding. This is values pushing back, right? So if I'm a conservative, most conservatives don't have a problem with climate change research. They have a problem with what that means for policy preferences, because it's at odds with certain policy preferences. This is exactly the same thing. So when we sit here as academics and saying, well, conservatives don't listen to us on climate change, or liberals don't listen to us on GMOs, on the safety for human consumption, they do exactly what we're doing. So doesn't answer your question yet, but it just says it's a pronounced phenomenon even within academia. So what do? Very often the idea of, some of you will remember Daniel Kahneman, who passed away recently, won a Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for his work in prospect theory and framing. And what he showed is that you can present the exact same information in different ways. In ways that either resonate with one mental framework or schema or with another. When we talk about gun control and gun safety, that's what we're doing. When I say gun control, most Americans are thinking Second Amendment, government overreach. We really ultimately don't want to change our Constitution. When I say gun safety, we're thinking gun locks, accidents, reasonable gun control. And so simply by changing the term, I'm attaching it to different sets of value systems. Mitt Romney, I think, was a great example when he ran for president. He never talked about climate change. I mean, he did in the early primary debates because he had to, but later on he never did. What he talked about was global competitiveness and energy independence. Global competitiveness, if you want to compete with the economies of China, Korea, Germany, and so on an emerging energy market that is going to be a billion dollar market, you need to invest in green energy. You need to invest in climate-friendly energies. Is it because of climate change? No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that will resonate with you, meaning global competitiveness. If you're conservative or liberal, the economics of it will resonate with you. And then energy independence, do you want to fight wars in countries that you cannot accurately place on a map? No. If you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, doesn't matter. You want energy independence. So then you need to invest in green energy. So I'm getting you on board with things that resonate with our values rather than the things that contradict. And I think that's one of the key things. When it comes to ultimately making decisions about what to do with those technologies, so CRISPR being a great example, a great example. Should we edit the human germline? There is no scientific answer, right? There is no way of framing this in a way that it resonates with people. We can inform that debate, to my point about civic science, that last big blue square. But ultimately, this is why I queued up John Evans' idea of the public's right to say no. If we do mean civic science and public engagement in its truest sense, the idea to say, well, maybe we shouldn't edit the human germline in ways that's heritable, that will be passed on for generations and generations. I'm not saying that's what we should be doing, but I'm saying that's a reasonable question, and there is no answer that science can provide. It can only tell us if we can do it safely to some degree, but they cannot tell us if that's, that we as a society should do that. So it depends a little bit on what your desired outcome is, but for facts, I think that's where the framing part is really crucially important. I think there was one over there, and then we can work our way back here.
Thank you for your discussion. You ended your talk by calling for the public to have a seat at the table in these complex issues. Mm-hmm. And I hear you, and I think most of us can agree that that would be wonderful and ideal. However, public engagement models have often failed, and yep. It isn't something you were calling for exactly. So perhaps now it's more important, but I think the challenges remain. So could you maybe explain the public a little bit more and maybe define that and talk about ways to better engage that public?
Yep. Agree with everything that you've said. Great question. And I'll start with a failure because that's or the shortcomings of some public engagement models, because I think that provides some of the answer to the last part of your question. I think the reason why public engagement models have sometimes had trouble is because, of course, ideally when we talk about, well, first of all, there's no single public, there's tons of publics, right? But even some of the most well-funded public engagement efforts that have tried to be as representative of the public as possible, because, of course, a lot of the folks who may be most affected by a technology may also care the least because they're not paying attention, they're working 3 jobs in the first place. Figuring out the intricacies of CRISPR or AI is just beyond the bandwidth of their daily lives. Those also tend to not show up at public engagement events. So we're losing the very people whose input we would value. Other things are, the other problems with it is that when I mentioned a lot of this happens in and on sciences terms, we define the information that we give to those groups. We almost frame the debate from the get-go. We pick the experts and so on and so forth. So the answer on how to do it better, then the last part is, when do you do public engagement? And do you do it early on about applications that are not even possible yet? And my argument is yes, we have to. The pushback from the scientific community is often, well, that's just fear-mongering because we can't even do that yet. Right? So CRISPR is a great example. Will we be able to at some point make edit the germline or edit the DNA of unborn babies to make them more intelligent, for instance? And ultimately, ironically, that's a big data and AI problem, right? Once we have, I don't know, 10 billion pieces of human DNA and all the behavioral and digital trace data surrounding it, which both China and Google and others are trying to build these large databases for personalized medicine. Once we have that, eventually we can pattern out with AI what the correlation is between behavioral data, environmental data, and genetic data, and what kind of outcomes that produces, right? So even for yourself, think about it. Every Google search you've made for that pain in your side, then your location data, if your phone has you in a hospital for a week, your credit card, you purchase certain medicines, and so on. Take that across 7.5 billion people that are alive or people that have passed away, and that database grows and grows, and eventually I can, and of course you use Ancestry.com or 23andMe, so I have your genetic data as well. That's kind of where that's going. And ultimately, that's the interesting thing for that is that we will have, or the question will be, that we will have the ability eventually, I don't think that's overly optimistic, to make people taller, to make them more intelligent. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but it will happen. Should we engage on that issue now, that we can't do it, before the deployment actually is possible? Because once the deployment is possible, it's hard to stop. Or should we not freak out the public, as some people think, and have that engagement later. So tons of open questions. My argument would be, and I think other people have argued this much more coherently than I can, that we need early stage public engagement. And that also resolves some of the other questions, and that is we can actually engage with audiences who care a lot about particular topics, sickle cell being one of them, who are directly affected by it. It doesn't mean we need to have a cross-section of America. We need to talk to people who are most likely to be affected by this. We can talk to highly interested publics and kind of anticipate some of the pushback, some of the concerns, some of the value-based considerations. And then that makes it much more likely that later on we can do subsequent rounds. But again, I think the second part to that engagement is also changing the DNA of science, to use that metaphor, to actually have an outlook among the scientific community that is much more in line with the idea that we are one societal actor as this rolls out. Jennifer Doudna and her co-author, and I'm totally blanking on his name, and I apologize right now, in their book Cracks in Creation. This is before she got the Nobel, when that book came out on CRISPR. There's a great first chapter where she talks about having grown up in Hawaii and always having this nightmare about a tsunami coming and wiping out her parents' house. And I'm paraphrasing. And now she's saying, well, now I'm creating this tsunami with that CRISPR technology that she eventually got a Nobel for. And it's my responsibility to protect kind of my parents' house, right? So, and so that kind of thinking, I think, is unique at this moment in science, or less frequent than it could be. And I think that's the second part to real engagement, is the changing the outlook in science. So that's a kind of a lengthy and slightly evasive answer, but that's the best I got.
Thank you for your comments. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the relationship between the military-industrial complex and scientific research. You mentioned military application 3 times in your talk, and it seems to me that when you're talking about changing the DNA of science, that the development of technology has always been wrapped up with warfare and the state. So how do we move from a model where confidentiality, secrecy, and a complex bureaucracy have been highly prioritized over the value of transparency that seems to be necessary for there to be any type of cooperative dialogue between the public and the scientific community?
Yep. Really good question. And so, part of that, of course, comes from the way we fund some research, DARPA being included, right? So some of the very short 5-year grants, let's make it happen. If it doesn't, funding goes away, and if it does, then we'll have various applications. A good example of what you're describing are the various kind of robotics application, kind of the robots that can go into minefields and whatever else, and seems like a pretty innocuous kind of application of mixture of engineering and AI. Those robots also walked around Singapore yelling at people for not wearing masks during COVID, right? And so you can, and again, maybe that's still a funny application. I find that slightly creepy, and it already kind of shows the bleeding over. I think the flip side, of course, is also a lot of the military applications that we've developed have also had unbelievably useful civilian applications, so it cuts both ways. And ultimately, I think we're seeing some of the similar kind of public engagement thinking. And maybe I'm overly optimistic, but CRISPR was a great example where we're seeing a sensibility even among military actors for how devastating some of these applications can be, right? So for example, a CRISPR application of biological warfare, where people all of a sudden, some agent that people inhale, not unreasonable, this is put forth as a possibility, people inhale and they develop certain types of lung cancer that are not dissimilar from what you would get from asbestos or from smoking. So I don't even know that this is warfare, but all of a sudden, people in a population are getting sick at rates much higher than normal. And even the military is saying, well, we need to figure out guardrails for this. We need to figure out ways of moving forward. So I think we're seeing a sensibility there. I don't think there's a real good resolution for transparency versus the necessary non-transparency. Wisconsin, we have our faculty voted at some point that will not take any research dollar that that we cannot fully disclose any finding on. So that also meant that some of our faculty got in fights with the Obama administration over gain-of-function research that we do in high-security labs, and because they published it in Nature, and there was a pushback from the Obama administration. I don't think there's a really good balance, but I agree with you that will become more and more of an issue. I think the Wisconsin solution is one, but that also moves us necessarily further down the research rankings. That comes with its own downsides. So I don't have a really good solution, but I think the problem is real, and it will only get more pronounced for AI, for CRISPR, for any of these that just have immense applications in that space. I think we may have time for one or two more, right? Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk and this discussion. So if we're moving away from science communication that's only on scientist terms, I'm wondering who you think should be initiating, convening, maybe moderating these civic science discussions.
Hopefully the last keynote at the end will speak to that as well, on what some of the other stakeholders can be. But I think the exciting thing about the Civic Science Fellow Program is that it brings together so many different actors, from journalists to people working in and with communities, to people in informal science education, to, again, academics, others, policy. One of the most interesting talks that I've heard in the last couple of years was by Abigail Echo Hawk, who is a native leader in Seattle. And she was speaking about data issues and data sovereignty during COVID, which hadn't been on my radar as much as it clearly should have been for a long time. And what she was saying is that during COVID, they collected data on their communities, and they collected it with a lot of fiscal risk because they didn't have a lot of money, and so on and so forth. And then the government came in and said, well, you want your data, this is great data, and we can actually, CDC and others came in. And one of the things that she was calling for in what was a very impassioned speech at the National Academy in the old auditorium, in the Kavli Auditorium, in the old building on Constitution. And she was basically saying, what we need to do is we need to flip the hierarchy. You are in service of us, right? So we're not here to help you collect data and then you tell us what they mean, but we will tell you what we need from you, and then you need to come in and you need to help us do that, which is a little bit of a Flint, Michigan problem, right? It's the same kind of logic. And I thought that flipping of hierarchies was a really good way of thinking about it. And I mean, coming back to the earlier question about, why do we have land grants and why do we do the work we do in service of society? I don't get paid at a public, and you guys are slightly different, but at a public university, I don't get paid because it's a good thing to have a professor. I get paid in service of teaching and other things and doing research that we like to call the Wisconsin ideas, or the boundaries of the university, or the boundaries of the state and beyond. Every land grant has a similar version. But I think that's, for me, where some of the leadership for those conversations comes from. We may not even decide, right? So we will be invited to some of those conversations. And that, again, goes back to my point about changing the DNA of science, meaning our outlook needs to fundamentally change as the technologies that we offer to the world have a potential to just be deeply disruptive and change what it means to be human, what it means to live a normal life, and so on and so forth. I think that's where I think the Templeton Foundation, who funds some of our work, calls it intellectual humility, and I think that's a really good term and probably a good principle for all of us to adopt. I always feel like that was a good last word, so I'm always like, thank you so much.